In the 1800s, a pioneer family in Oregon protected an entire acre of crops without a single drop of toxic chemical pesticide. Today, chemical companies claim your garden will be completely devoured by insects if you do not buy their expensive synthetic sprays. But early settlers survived massive locust swarms and beetle invasions, using brilliant natural methods that modern science has deliberately buried. We are going to count down 25 forgotten pest controls that actually saved pioneer families from absolute starvation in the Wild West. These survival techniques require no protective masks and leave no poisonous residue on the food you feed your family. You will learn how to defend your garden using the exact same plants and common materials those settlers carried in their covered wagons. Number 25 is the potent use of raw tobacco dust. Settlers noticed that wild tobacco plants were rarely bothered by chewing insects or hungry grasshoppers. They began saving the dust and leftover scraps from their smoking pipes to create a powerful defensive barrier around vulnerable young seedlings. The nicotine naturally found in tobacco leaves acts as a highly effective neurotoxin for small, soft-bodied insects. When a destructive caterpillar or crawling beetle tries to cross a line of tobacco dust, it becomes paralyzed and quickly dies. This natural poison breaks down quickly in the sunlight, leaving the soil perfectly safe for human food production. A modern gardener can replicate this pioneer trick by soaking loose rolling tobacco in a bucket of warm water. You let the dark brown liquid steep for 2 days before straining it into a simple watering can. Spraying this potent tea over your troubled cabbage leaves will instantly stop an active worm infestation without costing you $20 at the hardware store. Number 24 is the brilliant strategy of planting marigold borders. When wagon trains headed west, the pioneer women specifically packed tiny dried marigold seeds right alongside their vital corn and bean supplies. They knew that these bright orange flowers emitted a strong, bitter scent that confused flying pests searching for a meal. The pungent smell of a blooming marigold acts like an invisible shield against tomato hornworms and destructive squash bugs. The roots of the marigold plant also release a natural chemical compound that kills harmful microscopic nematodes hidden deep underground. Settlers would plant a solid ring of these cheerful flowers around their entire garden patch to build a living fortress. Today, you can buy a packet of marigold seeds for less than $2 and protect an entire row of heirloom tomatoes. You just push the small seeds into the dirt along the very edge of your raised garden beds in the early spring. By the middle of the summer, you will have a thick wall of colorful pest control that requires absolutely no maintenance. Number 23 is the legendary garlic water spray. Pioneer mothers understood that the sharp, burning sulfur compounds found in wild garlic were completely offensive to almost every garden pest. They would gather wild garlic bulbs from the riverbanks and crush them violently with heavy river stones to release the strong oils. This crushed garlic was then mixed with rainwater and left to ferment under the hot summer sun for several days. The resulting liquid was incredibly foul-smelling and possessed enough potency to drive away hungry deer and swarms of whiteflies. When brushed onto the delicate leaves of a growing bean plant, the garlic oil masked the natural sweet scent of the vegetable. You can easily make this exact same repellent in your modern kitchen using ordinary garlic cloves from the grocery store. Simply blend 1 entire bulb of garlic with 4 cups of water and let the milky mixture rest overnight. Strain the liquid through a cloth and spray it on your vulnerable roses to watch the destructive aphids disappear by morning. Number 22 is the defensive use of cold wood ash. Every pioneer cabin had a wood stove burning constantly for warmth and cooking, which produced massive piles of fine grey ash. Resourceful settlers discovered that pouring this ash in a thick circle around young plants stopped crawling insects dead in their tracks. The microscopic structure of wood ash is incredibly sharp and abrasive to the soft underbellies of destructive slugs and crawling snails. When the ash comes into contact with a moist pest, it rapidly pulls the water directly out of the creature, causing fatal dehydration. It acts as a physical barrier that pests simply refuse to cross, no matter how hungry they might be for your tender lettuce. You can utilize this historical method by saving the ashes from your winter fireplace or outdoor backyard fire pit. Sift out the large chunks of charcoal and carefully sprinkle the fine dust completely around the base of your garden vegetables. You must remember to reapply the ash barrier every single time a heavy rain washes your protective dust ring away. Number 21 is the clever implementation of stale beer traps. While beer was a valuable commodity on the western frontier, settlers would occasionally sacrifice a small cup of stale brew to save their crops. They would bury a shallow wooden bowl in the dirt near their root vegetables and fill it with the sour liquid. Slugs and snails are wildly attracted to the sweet smell of fermented yeast and the heavy sugars present in the dark beer. In the middle of the night, these slimy pests will abandon the garden plants and slither directly toward the strong, yeasty scent. They eventually fall into the buried bowl and happily drown in the liquid before they can consume a single bite of your harvest. Modern gardeners can set up this exact same frontier trap using a recycled tuna can pressed firmly into the garden soil. Pour in any cheap leftover beer just before the sun goes down and check your trap the following morning. You will be absolutely amazed by the sheer volume of destructive pests you can eliminate while you are fast asleep in your bed. Here is a critical piece of history that modern agricultural corporations desperately want you to ignore completely. The pioneer families who crossed the dangerous prairie did not have the luxury of running to a store if their crops failed. Their entire survival through the freezing winter depended entirely on the food they could protect and harvest during the short summer months. If a swarm of locusts or a sudden aphid infestation destroyed their vegetable plot, the family would literally face starvation. They could not afford to test theories, so they relied on practical, natural methods that yielded guaranteed immediate results. These pest control solutions were hardened in the brutal reality of frontier life, where failure meant an empty belly and grave danger. Today we are conditioned to believe that an insect problem requires a heavily armed response, with synthetic nervous system disruptors. But poisoning the very soil that feeds your family is a relatively new and incredibly destructive concept in human agricultural history. Returning to these pioneer methods helps restore the natural balance of predators and prey within your own backyard ecosystem. Number 20 is the gentle but lethal soap water wash. Making soap on the frontier was a grueling process that involved boiling animal fat with lye derived from hardwood ashes. Settlers noticed that when they dumped their dirty, soapy washwater onto the garden, the insect population dropped dramatically. Real fat-based soap effectively washes away the protective waxy coating that exists on the outside of soft-bodied insects like aphids. Without this crucial moisture barrier, the tiny pests rapidly dry out and perish under the hot afternoon sun. It is a purely mechanical death rather than a chemical poisoning, so the insects can never build a genetic immunity to the soap. You can mix 1 tablespoon of pure liquid Castile soap into a large spray bottle filled with ordinary tap water. Spraying this bubbly mixture directly onto the bodies of the pests will instantly halt an overwhelming garden invasion in its tracks. You should always perform this task in the early morning or late evening to prevent the bright sun from burning the wet leaves. Number 19 is the highly toxic rhubarb leaf tea. Pioneers grew rhubarb heavily because the thick red stalks provided a crucial source of tart fruit flavor during the early spring months. However, they completely understood that the massive green leaves contained dangerously high levels of toxic oxalic acid and were strictly forbidden to eat. Resourceful homesteaders decided to turn this naturally occurring poison into a weapon against the insects attempting to consume their brassica crops. They would boil the giant rhubarb leaves in an iron pot for 30 minutes to extract the potent acidic compounds into the water. The resulting dark green liquid was strained and splashed heavily over cabbage and broccoli plants to deter leaf-chewing worms. If you grow rhubarb today, you can harvest the giant leaves and simmer them in an old pot designated specifically for garden use. Add a tiny drop of liquid soap to the finished cooled liquid to help the natural poison stick firmly to the plant foliage. This historical organic pesticide is completely natural, but extremely powerful, so you must wash your hands thoroughly after applying it to your garden. Number 18 is the aggressive use of cayenne pepper dust. Traders moving along the pioneer trails carried small sacks of fiery dried peppers brought up from the deep southern territories. Homesteaders discovered that the burning capsaicin compound inside these red peppers was absolute torture for invading mammals and crawling insects alike. When a hungry rabbit or a destructive squirrel attempts to nibble a plant dusted with pepper, they experience immediate, intense pain. The spicy dust also irritates the sensitive membranes of garden beetles, forcing them to quickly abandon your precious vegetable stalks. The pioneers would finely grind the dried peppers using a heavy stone mortar and pestle to create a wicked defensive powder. Modern gardeners can purchase cheap generic cayenne pepper powder from any local discount grocery store to protect their spring seedlings. Simply dust the bright red powder heavily around the base of your plants and directly onto the lower hanging green leaves. The spicy barrier works perfectly until the next rainstorm washes it away, reminding you to diligently reapply your fiery frontier defense. Number 17 is the defensive ring of crushed eggshells. A flock of laying hens was absolute gold for a pioneer family, providing a steady source of daily protein on the harsh prairie. Nothing was ever wasted in those days, so the empty eggshells were carefully gathered and dried on the wooden windowsills. The women of the homestead would crush the brittle, dry shells into jagged fragments and spread them thickly around young, tender plants. To a soft-bodied slug or a crawling cutworm navigating across these sharp shells feels like dragging their bodies across broken glass. The pests refuse to cross this painful barrier, leaving the inner sanctum of the garden row completely untouched and safe. You can easily save your breakfast eggshells in a small container until you have gathered a substantial and useful amount. Crush them completely flat with the bottom of a heavy coffee mug before spreading them directly onto the dark garden topsoil. As an incredible added bonus, the eggshells will slowly decompose over the winter, providing essential calcium for your future tomato crops. Number 16 is the unusual technique of flour dusting for cabbage worms. Fine wheat flour was an incredibly precious baking commodity for settlers, but saving a winter cabbage crop was often considered slightly more important. When green caterpillars began devouring the leafy brassicas, the farmers would take a small handful of baking flour out to the fields. They would wait for the damp, early morning dew to coat the garden, and then dust the plain white flour directly over the cabbages. The tiny green worms would inadvertently eat the sticky flour as they chomped relentlessly through the thick green vegetable leaves. When the hot midday sun finally arrived, the consumed flour would literally bake and harden inside the worms, causing them to quickly explode. This bizarre but highly effective method is still incredibly useful today if you are fighting a massive infestation of velvet green caterpillars. Grab a cheap bag of all-purpose flour and sprinkle a heavy white dusting over your damaged plants early tomorrow morning. You will find the dried remains of the destructive pests scattered across the dirt the very next afternoon, proving the pioneers were right. Let us pause to examine how we completely lost touch with these brilliant historical methods of organic pest control over the decades. Following the massive global conflicts of the 20th century, chemical companies needed a brand new domestic market for their leftover synthetic nerve agents. They launched massive advertising campaigns designed specifically to convince home gardeners that nature was a dirty, chaotic enemy that must be chemically sterilized. The old wise methods of companion planting and physical barrier traps were suddenly mocked as outdated folklore and ignorant peasant traditions. A generation of knowledge built upon thousands of hours of desperate pioneer survival observation was swept away by bright plastic spray bottles. The modern consumer was carefully trained to solve every single garden problem by purchasing a toxic proprietary product from a massive corporation. But the pioneer gardener operated under the fundamental belief that you must work alongside nature rather than constantly dropping bombs upon it. They understood that a completely sterile garden is an unnatural and highly vulnerable environment that invites total disaster the moment the chemicals fade. Embracing these old ways is an act of quiet rebellion against an industry that profits heavily from your continued gardening anxiety and fear. Number 15 is the implementation of copper wire rings. Settlers mining in the Western Territories often had access to scrap pieces of pure copper wire left over from early telegraph line constructions. They discovered, quite by accident, that wrapping a thick piece of raw copper entirely around the base of a plant stopped snail damage completely. There is a fascinating biological reaction that occurs when the slimy underside of a slug physically touches a piece of bare copper metal. The moisture mixes with the raw copper to create a sudden, mild electrical shock that violently repels the soft-bodied creature backward. The pest is not killed, but it is thoroughly terrified and will completely abandon the area to seek out an easier, unprotected meal. You can utilize this brilliant scientific defense today by purchasing a roll of cheap copper foil tape from any local hardware supply store. Stick the metallic tape completely around the rim of your favorite ceramic flower pots to protect your beautiful hostas from nighttime damage. As long as the shiny copper remains relatively clean and free of heavy dirt, the electrical barrier will function perfectly for many years. Number 14 is the fragrant strategy of companion planting sweet basil. Early Italian immigrants traveling westward brought small, precious bundles of dried basil seeds to start their new lives on the untamed frontier. They instinctively planted these aromatic green herbs directly next to their vital tomato crops to create a mutually beneficial growing environment. The incredibly strong, volatile oils produced by the basil plant emit a heavy fragrance that completely confuses the destructive tomato hornworm moth. When the adult moth attempts to locate a tomato plant to lay her devastating eggs, the basil scent masks the target completely. This clever trick prevents the massive green caterpillars from ever being born onto your precious heirloom tomato stalks in the first place. To replicate this pioneer success, you should plant 3 basil seeds for every single tomato plant you place into your summer garden. As the warm weather arrives, the protective basil will grow tall and bushy, creating an invisible fortress of scent across your entire yard. You will harvest gorgeous, unblemished tomatoes while simultaneously growing enough fresh herbs to make delicious sauces all summer long. Number 13 is the aggressive dusting of crushed limestone. Before modern diatomaceous earth was readily available commercially, pioneers would often grind soft limestone rocks into a very fine, dry, chalky powder. They would toss thick, white handfuls of this dusty earth directly onto their potato plants when the terrible striped beetles began to arrive. The incredibly fine limestone dust is highly absorbent and physically coats the breathing pores located along the sides of the invading insects. It rapidly suffocates the adult beetles and dries out the soft, vulnerable larvae before they can consume the green potato leaves. This physical earth powder causes absolute chaos for any crawling insect while remaining completely harmless to the pioneer children playing nearby. You can buy bags of agricultural limestone powder quite cheaply at any modern farm supply center today to protect your own root crops. Sift the white powder heavily over your vulnerable garden leaves when the weather forecast promises at least 3 days of dry, sunny conditions. The bright white coating will naturally wash away during the next heavy rainstorm, returning essential calcium back into your rich, dark topsoil. Number 12 is the brewing of pungent onion skin tea. Onions were a massive staple of the pioneer winter diet because they kept perfectly well in a dark, cold root cellar for many months. The papery, dry outer skins were never thrown out, but were rather gathered into large glass jars to create a potent defensive spray. The dry skins contain highly concentrated levels of sulfur compounds and an organic chemical called quercetin, which acts as a powerful natural repellent. Settlers would steep massive handfuls of these saved skins in boiling water until the liquid turned the color of very dark brown leather. Spraying this deeply pungent onion tea onto tender green beans effectively masked the sweet vegetable smell and kept hungry deer far away. Whenever you prepare a meal in your modern kitchen, you can simply peel the dry skins off your onions and save them in a bag. Boil them rapidly on your stovetop and let the dark liquid cool completely before transferring it into a cheap plastic spray bottle. A heavy misting of this homemade sulfur water will send rabbits and local deer running away from your delicious garden harvest entirely. Number 11 is the strategic use of fragrant cedar sawdust. Pioneers engaged in heavy timber work knew exactly how strongly fresh-cut western cedar wood smelled when it was first split open. They noticed that almost no native insects would ever burrow into or consume the wood of a fallen cedar tree in the forest. The natural aromatic oils locked inside the cedar wood are incredibly toxic and repellent to dozens of different garden beetles and crawling ants. Homesteaders would gather the leftover sawdust from the lumber mill and use it as a thick protective mulch around their valuable fruit trees. The potent wood chips would slowly release their strong protective oils into the surrounding air, effectively driving away any incoming pest invasions. You can easily purchase bags of natural cedar mulch from any big box hardware store today to implement this exact same defensive strategy. Lay a thick ring of the fragrant wooden chips around the base of your apple trees or directly onto your winding garden pathways. The wonderful smell will delight your family while simultaneously sending a clear warning signal to any insect looking to establish a permanent home. Number 10 is the strange but wonderful sour milk spray. Before electric refrigeration was invented, pioneer families struggled constantly to keep their daily fresh dairy supplies from spoiling in the hot summer heat. When a bucket of fresh cow's milk finally turned dangerously sour, the homesteader would simply march it directly out to the vegetable patch. The natural lactic acid and competing beneficial bacteria found in spoiled milk act as a miraculous cure for powdery mildew and microscopic mites. When the milky liquid dries onto a garden leaf, it creates an invisible protective protein film that prevents terrible fungal spores from taking root. Small insects like aphids also violently detest the sticky, dried milk proteins and will rapidly evacuate any plant that has been heavily coated. If you find a forgotten carton of expired milk hiding in the very back of your refrigerator, do not pour it down the sink. Dilute the old milk with an equal amount of fresh tap water and pour it into your outdoor garden sprayer for immediate deployment. Coating your squash and cucumber leaves with this mixture will completely stop the spread of devastating white fungal diseases across your yard. Let us consider the immense physical reality of maintaining a thriving garden in the Wild West without modern tools or gasoline-powered machinery. The pioneer men and women worked from the moment the sun breached the horizon until the evening light completely faded away into darkness. They possessed incredibly calloused hands and aching backs from pulling tough prairie weeds and hauling heavy buckets of river water for miles. They did not view pest control as a separate specialized hobby, but rather as an integrated daily chore necessary for their continued existence. Every single time they walked past a garden row, they were actively observing, pulling, crushing, and adjusting the natural environment around them. They learned exactly when certain beetles would hatch, and knew precisely which wild weed would drive those specific terrible insects away. When we adopt these simple historical methods, we are truly honoring the incredible physical struggles of those who tamed the vast western frontier. We are proving that human beings can successfully grow beautiful, abundant food simply by paying close attention to the intricate rules of the natural world. Expensive, toxic, synthetic sprays are merely a lazy, modern shortcut that ultimately degrades the beautiful, living soil our ancestors worked so hard to build. Number 9 is the aggressive planting of mint root borders. Pioneer mothers absolutely loved fresh mint for flavoring their hot tea and soothing the troubled stomachs of their often sickly young children. However, they quickly learned that this wildly aggressive green herb possessed incredibly powerful abilities to drive away destructive garden ants and hungry rodents. The menthol oil produced by the mint plant completely overwhelms the delicate scent trails that worker ants use to navigate the garden environment. Furthermore, hungry field mice detest the strong, burning smell of peppermint and will violently avoid crossing a dense patch of the green leaves. Settlers would plant strong mint borders around the entire perimeter of their vulnerable root cellars to protect their winter potato supplies from thievery. Because mint grows so aggressively, you should strongly consider planting it inside buried plastic pots to prevent it from conquering your entire yard. The strong green leaves will erupt out of the containers and form an aromatic wall of defense around your delicate spring vegetable beds. Plucking a few mint leaves and crushing them gently in your hands will release an invisible cloud of menthol that clears pests away immediately. Number 8 is the historical cultivation of the toxic tansy plant. The tall, yellow-flowering tansy was highly respected by early settlers as a deeply potent medicinal herb and a fierce protector of the homestead. Women would deliberately scatter tansy seeds directly alongside the wooden foundations of their rough log cabins to keep the interior living space clean. Tansy contains volatile toxic compounds like thujone, which are wildly offensive to flying houseflies, invasive mosquitoes, and incredibly destructive cutworms. The pungent, bitter aroma practically builds an invisible chemical fence that flying insects simply refuse to cross under any circumstances. Pioneer farmers also tied large, dried bundles of yellow tansy flowers directly onto the wooden beams of their barns to protect their valuable livestock. Modern gardeners can grow this hardy perennial flower along the outermost edges of their property to serve as a brilliant first line of defense. You must be extremely careful never to plant tansy near grazing animals or consume it yourself, because the thick leaves are entirely poisonous. However, as a pure botanical shield against invasive flying pests, this aggressive pioneer weed has absolutely no equal in the modern gardening world. Number 7 is the chaotic but highly effective method of poultry patrol. Before the invention of synthetic granular pesticides, a pioneer family relied heavily on the endless, ravenous appetite of a wandering flock of ducks. These noisy, waddling birds were considered essential farm workers because their entire daily routine consisted of hunting down and consuming destructive garden bugs. A flock of hungry ducks will systematically march through a row of cabbages, pulling thousands of green worms and hiding slugs out of the dirt. Unlike heavy, scratching chickens, the flat, webbed feet of a common duck will not aggressively tear up the fragile roots of your vegetable plants. The pioneers would simply open the wooden garden gate for exactly 1 hour every afternoon to let the birds perform a massive biological sweep. While managing a loud flock of birds might not be entirely practical for a small urban backyard, the underlying principle remains incredibly important. Encouraging natural insect predators to visit your property is the absolute best way to manage an overwhelming pest population over the long term. Hanging simple bird feeders and building small wooden birdhouses will quickly invite dozens of hungry feathered soldiers directly into your own private garden. Number 6 is the sacrificial planting of colorful nasturtium trap crops. Early Western settlers possessed very few seeds, so planting something solely to be eaten by insects seemed like a terrible waste of resources. But they quickly learned that sacrificing a small patch of spicy nasturtium flowers could easily save an entire massive field of essential winter pumpkins. Nasturtiums naturally attract devastating clouds of black aphids and hungry cabbage-white butterflies, drawing them entirely away from your valuable vegetable crops. The bright orange flowers essentially scream for attention, pulling every single destructive insect in the area toward their incredibly tasty, peppery green leaves. The pioneer farmer would let the flowers become completely infested before pulling the entire diseased plant out of the ground and tossing it directly into the fire. You can easily utilize this brilliant sacrificial strategy by planting a thick border of cheap nasturtium seeds 10 feet away from your main vegetable plot. As the season progresses, you will happily watch the distant flowers become completely covered in terrible pests, while your actual food remains perfectly clean. The beautiful, spicy blossoms that survive the insect onslaught can even be picked and eaten in your summer salads, just as the pioneers did. Number 5 is the incredibly clever sticky molasses trap. Refined white sugar was a rare and extremely expensive luxury on the western frontier, but dark, sticky molasses was heavily traded and widely available. Homesteaders figured out that they could use this thick, sweet syrup to construct devastating physical traps for jumping and flying insects that ruined crops. They would take pieces of bright yellow cardboard or old wooden shingles and paint them completely with a heavy, thick coat of raw molasses. The color yellow naturally attracts whiteflies and destructive gnats who mistake the bright wooden boards for a massive, blooming summer flower. When the eager insects land on the board, their delicate wings become instantly trapped in the thick, sticky syrup, preventing them from ever escaping. You can recreate this non-toxic frontier trap today by spreading a thick layer of petroleum jelly or cheap syrup onto any yellow plastic cup. Place the sticky bright cups onto wooden stakes deeply driven into the ground right next to your prized tomato and pepper plants. Within just a few short days, you will find hundreds of dead pests permanently glued to the yellow plastic, proving the old trap works perfectly. Number 4 is the strange buttermilk and flour suffocating spray. When spider mites began destroying an entire crop of green beans, a pioneer farmer could not simply wait for a heavy rainstorm to save them. They combined sour buttermilk with ordinary baking flour and a massive bucket of well water to create an incredibly sticky defensive garden paste. When this thick, milky liquid was thrown over a heavily infested bean plant, the flour and milk mixture would coat the microscopic crawling mites. As the hot afternoon sun beat down on the garden, the strange mixture would suddenly contract and bake into a very tight, restrictive film. The drying paste literally crushes the fragile microscopic insects against the surface of the green leaf, eliminating thousands of invisible pests in a single afternoon. Modern growers dealing with an impossible spider mite infestation can mix 1/2 cup of buttermilk and 4 cups of flour into 5 gallons of water. Spray the thick white liquid heavily underneath the damaged green leaves, where the tiny red mites usually weave their destructive, delicate webs. The baked white crust will slowly flake off into the dirt over the next week, taking the dead, crushed pests completely away with it. Number 3 is the deeply powerful black walnut leaf tea. The pioneers noticed that absolutely nothing green could ever grow directly underneath the sprawling dark canopy of a massive native black walnut tree. They quickly realized the tree produced a highly toxic natural chemical called juglone, which acted as a brutal defense mechanism against competing plants and hungry insects. Bold settlers would carefully gather the fallen green walnut leaves and steep them in boiling hot water to extract the dark, toxic chemical compounds. This incredibly strong tea was essentially an organic, broad-spectrum pesticide that would instantly drop caterpillars and devastating beetles completely dead upon contact. Because the juglone chemical is so universally toxic to organic life, the farmer had to use this dark brew incredibly sparingly to avoid killing the garden entirely. If you possess a black walnut tree on your property, you can carefully experiment with this potent historical pesticide on your most stubbornly infested areas. You must never spray this dark walnut tea onto delicate young seedlings or sensitive heirloom vegetables, because the natural poison might simply burn them away. It is best used as a heavily targeted strike against massive swarms of terrible blister beetles hiding in the rough outer edges of your property. Number 2 is the ingenious tomato leaf spray. When homesteaders first began growing tomatoes, they brought with them the old-world knowledge that the plant belonged to the highly toxic nightshade family. While the red fruit was delicious and safe, the fuzzy green leaves contained a potent natural chemical called tomatine that repelled almost everything. The farmer would simply prune the heavy lower branches off the tomato plant and chop the fuzzy green leaves into very small pieces. Soaking these chopped toxic leaves in warm water overnight created a highly potent alkaloid spray that paralyzed aphids and confused terrible leaf-eating worms. The tomato plant was essentially providing the brilliant farmer with the exact chemical weapon needed to defend the rest of the vulnerable garden plot. You can easily utilize this brilliant self-sustaining strategy every single time you prune the wild suckers off your growing summer tomato plants. Soak 2 generous cups of the chopped green leaves in 2 cups of warm tap water before straining the toxic green liquid through a cloth. Spraying this potent nightshade tea over your vulnerable cabbages will instantly protect them using a poison that breaks down entirely naturally in the sunlight. Number 1 is the magnificent Three Sisters companion planting method. When the very first European pioneers arrived, they were saved from total starvation by the brilliant agricultural wisdom of the native indigenous tribes. The incredible concept of planting corn, beans, and squash completely intertwined in the exact same mound of dirt is the ultimate frontier pest control. The tall cornstalk provides a sturdy climbing pole for the heavy beans, while the beans pull essential nitrogen out of the open air. Meanwhile, the massive prickly squash leaves spread widely across the lower dirt, creating a painful physical barrier that hungry raccoons and crawling pests refuse to cross. This ancient, complex ecosystem confuses flying insects completely, because the vast mixture of different scents makes it impossible for them to locate their preferred target. Planting these 3 specific seeds together eliminates the massive, vulnerable monocultures that modern synthetic pesticides were originally designed to fiercely protect. You simply build a wide mound of dark dirt and plant your corn directly in the center, surrounded by beans and bordered by squash. You will witness a beautiful, wild tangle of abundant food that perfectly defends itself the exact way nature originally intended for thousands of years. Here is my final challenge to you for this upcoming growing season. I want you to choose just one of these completely forgotten Wild West pest controls and test it proudly in your own backyard dirt. Crush up those eggshells, save your pungent onion skins, or plant a bright yellow border of defensive marigolds alongside your valuable tomato stalks. When you successfully protect your harvest using these natural techniques, you are actively reclaiming a vital piece of lost human agricultural independence. You are proving that a gardener does not need a toxic plastic bottle or a protective mask to provide clean, healthy food for their family. Please share down in the comments exactly which historical pioneer method you are going to fiercely deploy against the hungry insects arriving this summer.